People's living standards have stalled because productivity and growth have stalled. Public services are under probably more strain than they've ever been.
In a way, to me, it's sort of like a swear word sometimes. It's just like fiscal.
Public finances are not in a great shape, to be honest. Will we all have to just pay more tax in the future?
Right, folks, welcome back to Public Knowledge. If you, like me, have ever felt confused about how this country is run, how it works, then this is the podcast for you. Because we're on a mission to uncover the deals and relationships that are shaping the country we find ourselves in today, and for better or worse, the kind of country we could find ourselves in tomorrow. We break down the big stuff and make it make sense, one episode at a time. Now, in today's episode, we're showing you the money. We're lifting the lid on Scotland's finances, from unpacking the mysterious Barnett Formula to asking, what on earth does the word fiscal even mean? Yeah, that and much more. Now, this is part one of a two-part interview with Professor Mairi Spowage, leading expert and frankly saving grace on all of this stuff. Stay tuned for part two next week, where we'll be diving into North Sea oil and gas revenues and whether either Westminster or Holyrood can be let off the hook. But in the meantime, let's dive in. Thank God that people like Mairi exist in the world, because I was trying to prepare for this podcast. We're talking about the Scottish public finances, we're talking about the economy, and I was just going into a bit of a tailspin, if I'm honest, Mairi. So thank goodness for people like you. So you're Professor of Practice and Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute at Strathclyde University. You were also Head of National Accounts at the Scottish Government and the Deputy Chief Exec at the Scottish Fiscal Commission.
That's right. So yes. Yeah, I've done lots of different roles working with the numbers on this. Yeah,
and you've got a whole host of other positions, but we've only got an hour. So if I was to go into all of that, we'd use the whole podcast to be talking about your amazing CV. But I did hear you say somewhere that when you went into Scottish Government Head of National Accounts, you found your calling. And I just thought, yes, this is the woman we need.
No, absolutely. When I started working on the Head of National Accounts, really that job's about producing all of the statistics on the Scottish economy, making sure we're measuring it properly, and actually all the public finance information. And I started doing that job in 2014 when that was very important because it featured quite heavily in the independence debate and so on. So it's a really interesting area to be responsible for, and a really important area to inform the public debate properly about, how big is Scotland's economy, how is it growing, and what do we spend money on, and how much do we raise in tax. All these are really important questions to understand.
Yeah, and it feels to me like not enough of us really understand it. And I know that your institute, Fraser of Allander, you publish briefings, you do a lot of outreach work trying to help people get to grips with this. But certainly, me and my friends sitting at the coffee shop of a morning and just, putting the world to rights. But actually speaking to them and just in preparation for this interview with you, I was saying, guys, do you actually know where our money comes from? Nope. And I was like, nope, neither do I. Do you know what impact it has on our public finances if a business decides to invest in Scotland or decides to headquarter here in Scotland? Nope, neither do I. And it just strikes me that, so many of us care about making Scotland an excellent place to live and to work and to bring up our families. But because of the complexities and we understand so little of it, that we don't really know where to be pushing to make it a more thriving, prosperous place. And that's why hopefully this discussion is going to start. I'm sure we'll only scratch the surface because it's such a complicated area, but that's where we want to go with this. So just give us a big picture view, why are the public finances important? What impact does it have on our everyday lives? Why should we care?
No, it's a fair point, and we do need to partition a little bit, the economy more broadly and the performance of the economy, which can be about how sort of wealthy we feel, how much we're earning from our jobs, whether we have a job maybe, or the sorts of investment we can see in our local areas, from the public finances, which are a kind of slice of the economy really, where we're talking about how much tax is being raised from various sources and how much the government is, how the government's using that tax to provide us with public services. So when we're talking about the public finances, really what we're talking about is how much money is going out of our pay packets in different sorts of taxes, or maybe if we own a business, how much we're paying in things like corporation tax. So that's what goes into the coffers that the government have. And then how much are we getting out in terms of public services? You know, how good are the schools that we're using, the hospitals we're using? You know, how are we interacting with the justice system maybe? All of these things are paid for in the end by our taxes. So the public finances are sort of integral to our lives and how we interact with public services.
And if you were to give an assessment here of where we stand in Scotland in terms of our public finances, a bit of a health check, what would you say? So
this is all complicated quite a lot by the fact that Scotland is a devolved government and it isn't, you know, an independent state in its own right. So it's tied up and linked to the health of the UK public finances. And I would say that the UK public finances are not in a great shape, to be honest. We've borrowed quite a lot, particularly over the last few years because of COVID and other shocks to our economy, and help shore up businesses or households, the energy price shock as well. So lots of money's been borrowed. So we're quite indebted as a country overall. And this means that, as we've all seen, the government feels like it needs to take quite tough choices to be within certain rules it wants to follow to reassure financial markets that the UK is still a sort of safe bet, that we don't have too much debt, we can still be relied upon to pay our debts and these sorts of things. And within that, the Scottish Government have also had a tumultuous few years in terms of trying to balance its budget, which it must do as a devolved government, but essentially sort of committing to quite a lot of things that maybe it can't afford, and then having to cut other things in order to meet these requirements of balance in the budget. So I'd say that things aren't in a brilliant shape. And one of the reasons why is because public services are under probably more strain than they've ever been in many cases because of an ageing population. And so the outlook for the future is that we're all getting older, which means we might well be calling on public services more. So there's a big discussion at the moment about the sustainability of public services in general and what that means for our public finances. Like, will we all have to just pay more tax in future because we're all going to cost a bit more to look after as we get older?
Yeah, and let's come back to all of that stuff. But in order to set the scene then for people who are listening to this podcast who just want to understand where does Scotland's money come from, should we break that down piece by piece and just really walk us through it gently, ease us in?
No, absolutely. And it is very complicated, and we do spend a lot of our time talking to people and explaining it to them, including people like the Parliament, and the Finance Committee who we support, just trying to understand the complexities. So, in terms of the money that the Scottish Government spends, they get most of it in a block grant from Westminster. And this is determined by a very complex formula called the Barnett Formula. But basically, it's a big chunk of money that's given to the Scottish Government to spend on the things that it's responsible for, which are things like health and education and the justice system and so on. So that's the main source of income.
And just to be clear, that money is not just a kind of direct transfer from Westminster. It's Scottish money as well that's gone into the Westminster coffers that then gets redistributed out. How does that work? Because some people would say Scotland gets a subsidy from Westminster. What would you say to that?
So I would say that all taxes that aren't devolved, and we'll come back to the ones that are, all go into the UK government's coffers. So this includes everything like VAT, national insurance, corporation tax. All of those taxes are raised from businesses and households right across the UK, and they all go into the UK government's pot. The UK government then sort of portions that up amongst departments that cover functions sometimes for England and Wales, sometimes for Great Britain, sometimes for the UK as a whole. It varies depending on the area. And the portioning of that kind of decides how much we're going to get for devolved services in Scotland. The other taxes that are paid by people in Scotland, particularly income tax, is a devolved tax. So that money kind of goes directly to the Scottish Government for spending on services, but most taxes do get paid into this UK government coffers, and then the amount of money that goes to Scotland is determined by this formula that I've already mentioned. I will say though, if we look at how much is spent on services overall across the UK, Scotland has more spent on it per person than the UK average, to the tune of about 20% more per person. So, to be honest, if you look at the quantum of spending, Scotland does pretty well out of the Barnett Formula. It does get more spent on it per person.
Okay, so we've got the block grant,
Mm-hmm.
and then we've got the taxes that are devolved to the Scottish Government that get paid from people living in Scotland
Yeah.
into the Scottish Government funds.
Yep. And the biggest one of those is income tax. So we'll see that we have a different income tax system in Scotland now since it was devolved. It was devolved in 2016. And we now, instead of having a 3-band income tax system, we have a 6-band income tax system. And what it means is if you earn less than kind of medium wages, you pay a little bit less tax in Scotland, up to the tune of about £20 a year. So it's not a huge amount less, but a little bit less. And if you earn more than median salaries, you're going to be paying more income tax than if you were in the rest of the UK. And by the time you get to around £50,000, that's around £1,500 more a year you'll pay. So the income tax system is different. It's tilted to be slightly more progressive, i.e. those who are further up the income distribution will pay a bit more in Scotland than the rest of the UK. But overall, it raises more revenue. So the amount of tax that's raised from this is more than if the rates in the rest of the UK prevailed in Scotland.
That's an interesting one, because I've heard discussion around the income tax bands and the fact that, the higher earners pay more tax, that can sometimes come with behavioural changes that then impact on the amount of income tax that is then taken in. Can you talk about that a bit and unpack that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, and this is an interesting area of research, actually, trying to understand the extent to which people change their behaviour as a result of higher taxes. And all of the academic writing on this would suggest that there is a response. People respond to higher rates of tax, and they might respond in lots of different ways. They might respond by maybe not working as many hours as they would have done if the tax had been lower. They might view a promotion or something like slightly differently, so they might be less likely to take it. And it might be that they make decisions about incorporating, so they decide to set themselves up as a business rather than just take income in the traditional way because of tax rates. All of these decisions are decisions that people actually will make. Not everyone will make them by any matter of means, but they do happen. In a population, they can happen. These things occur, and the evidence would suggest the more that you earn, the more likely you are to look at some of these things. And you can understand why, because the bigger difference it would make to you in terms of how much money you get in your hand. So all of these things are definitely there, they definitely exist. The question is, how big are they and to what extent do they happen? And that is quite difficult, but there is a lot of research which tries to estimate these, particularly research that's done by HMRC. So yes, the further up the income distribution you go, the larger these effects are. To the extent where some of the changes that Scottish Government have made to the very top rate of tax recently, you're sort of losing maybe 90% of the revenue that you would generate if people just behaved in exactly the same way.
90%.
Because of the likely, because you can do things like put money into your pension and that sort of thing, and these are all behaviours which all of us could probably relate to doing if you're thinking about what you get in your hand at the end of the month and, what's the most tax efficient thing to do. There's a smaller issue potentially of people who would have come to Scotland maybe deciding not to. Even if it's one person in 100 who would have made that decision, then not making that decision. There's some evidence for that from the studies HMRC have done for the very high, highest earners. But it's kind of probably too early to say to what extent it's impacting people further down the income distribution. But all of these things people do take into account and they do amend their behaviour. It's just, I suppose, from a government perspective, is the revenue that we get from making this decision, still worth it? Does it still raise more revenue, and is that worth it? Because obviously, these things about the tax environment can also potentially impact on things like competitiveness or business decisions about investment too. They're not just about individual decisions.
And just on that point about business investment and attracting talent, attracting companies to come and say headquarter here or whatnot, we'll never really know, will we, if this is putting companies off, putting people off? I mean, there's no real way of knowing, is there?
So it's really interesting because, ideally in, an academic study, you would do some sort of randomised controlled trial. You would give people different income tax rates and see what they did, but that's not ethical and not legal, I don't think. So essentially what we try and do in economics is try and create an experiment but without having done one. So you sort of look at things like, so you can do things like look at a similar people in Scotland and England and see how they're behaving, for example. So you can do that to try and sort of almost build this control group who wasn't, in part of the change. So there is a lot of research like that going on to try and create those conditions to understand, but it is very difficult because building that, what we would call a counterfactual, what would have happened in the absence of the change, is quite challenging. But there's lots of research going on trying to do that. But with business investment decisions, again, I mean, that's even more difficult because, there's so many things that go into a business investment decisions, which can often be about things like signalling from the government or just general messaging or even regulatory differences, access to talent, all of these things go into decisions by businesses. So it can be quite difficult to know what's the straw that breaks the camel's back or the thing that really clinches it for a business to locate in a particular place.
And just to bring this back to why this is so important for what we're talking about, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously the more people that move up here, that earn money here, that then pay taxes here, the more businesses that locate here will have a knock-on impact on the amount of public revenue we can take in. Is that? I mean, it probably isn't as simple as that, if only. But just, can you break that down for us? Like it matters, doesn't it?
It absolutely does matter. And I'll just cover a few things here. I mean, lots of people ask me questions about, why do we want growth in the economy? Why would we want growth? And that can be through things like concerns about environmental degradation. What are we spoiling essentially to have that growth? And it can be about things like, is the growth kind of equally distributed and are we just increasing inequality? And all of those things are fair enough and they should be checks on growth. We shouldn't be growing by degrading our natural resources, certainly not anymore. We're hopefully past that. Many people will reasonably want people to equally benefit from growth or at least to reduce inequality that we can see in our society. But what we've seen over the last 15 years since the financial crisis is a sort of stagnation in productivity and poor growth has directly impacted on people's living standards. So people's wages and overall living standards are improved by investment and wealth in the economy. These things are completely intrinsically linked. So, people's living standards have stalled because productivity and growth have stalled. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't break the link between resource use and growth. We should. But we still do need growth and prosperity in our economy to improve our living standards. And then that feeds through to the issue of what we need to do is to ensure that we've got plenty of people paying plenty of tax so that we can fund our public services that we need. And one of the challenges we have in Scotland is about the outlook for our working age population. And these are people who tend to be the ones who are working and paying tax, which then pays for the public services for those who are older. And this is why the challenge of an ageing population is difficult, because if we have a sort of shrinking working age population while the older population is growing, then that balance between those who are paying tax and those who are drawing down on services might get a bit out of kilter. And that's the challenge, of whether our finances are sustainable. And that's why we talk a lot about fiscal sustainability. No, not everyone likes that word fiscal, but that's what we're talking about is will we be able to pay for the services that we need with a sort of shrinking tax base potentially?
Yeah, and so that's super clear. And I think just putting a pin in that point that you made about why economic growth and prosperity is absolutely intrinsically linked to the quality of our public services and our living standards, because I think that can get lost on people because, economic language, even the word fiscal, as you've just alluded to, is just tough. So just on that point, before we go any further, fiscal, in a way, to me, it's sort of like a swear word sometimes. It's just like fiscal. Break it down. Like, what does that actually mean? Like fiscal event, fiscal settlement, please.
Yeah, it just means about tax and spend, so what are we spending money on and how are we raising money? That's essentially what it means. And it's used quite often when we're thinking about the sorts of interventions our government can do in the economy. That's when we talk about monetary policy versus fiscal policy. And monetary policy is what your central bank does. It's setting interest rates that we know that in this country the Independent Bank of England does. So that's controlling the money supply and thinking about all that. So that's sort of the central bank's problem, and they're independent of government. Fiscal policy is the government's responsibility. How do we tax? Who do we tax? And to what extent? And then what do we spend that money on? So really, it's everything about tax and spend is fiscal.
And so going back then to how Scotland gets its money in, before the Scottish Parliament was set up in 1999, even then though, since 1978, I understand, we've had the Barnett Formula in place. Because actually I think a lot of people think Scottish finances in the way that we know them now only really emerged from 1999. So the Barnett Formula from 1978, what happened before that? Just, a bit of historical curiosity there.
Yeah, and my understanding is, obviously I'm far too young to remember it, but my understanding is it was done on a much more ad hoc basis, and that was one of the reasons that the Barnett Formula came in. So I said it was complex, and I suppose one of the strengths of the Barnett Formula itself is that it is quite simple. It's the increase in the block grant for particular areas for Scotland is based on what's spent in England. Mm-hmm. What's spent on health in England, we get a particular share based on our population, mm-hmm. and that's it.
And that's roughly 10%. So if the UK government is going to spend, let's say, £100 million on the English NHS, we would get a corresponding 10 million.
10 million uplift in our budget. Yeah. Also, if they chose to cut the budget on something like, say, justice and policing, again, our budget would be reduced. So they go both ways. So it's supposed to keep sort of spending on these devolved services kind of similar in different parts. And one of the reasons we've got higher public spending in Scotland is that sort of starting point was higher for Scotland at the time that the Barnett Formula was put in place. But there's obviously also been complicated reasons about the way our populations have moved in different directions and stuff over the period that I'll not get into. But we have ended up with this level of spending in Scotland that's kind of higher. Now, what I would say is that's not on the basis that we need it to be higher. Now, need is a loaded word, but it's not on the basis that things cost 20% more in Scotland to deliver, because that's not the case. It's just because of the way the formula has worked and that starting point that we spend more on services. And I think this is one of the interesting questions, I suppose, for the longevity of this. Is this still the right approach? Through COVID, for example, there was some analysis done on the kind of support that was given to businesses, for example. That was all done through the business rate system, which meant the monies that were spent in England were sort of then Barnetted to Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Fine, to help businesses in Scotland. But what if there had been a bigger outbreak in Scotland, or it had been more severe, or Scotland had more of the certain types of businesses that were impacted? There wasn't any, it was all done just through this population share. And didn't take account of maybe there would be differential need. Now, as it happened through that crisis, there wasn't really differential need, but that was just through luck. So there's a question there. What would it have meant if there had been a really severe outbreak, or particularly businesses being impacted, say in Wales? What would have been the funding mechanism to support those businesses appropriately? So it's interesting. It's very mechanical and straightforward, but it's not necessarily been designed on the basis of need. And if we're thinking about things like devolution in England and maybe block grants to parts of England, I think this is a conversation that's probably going to keep coming up, although you'll never hear politicians in Scotland calling for the end of the Barnett Formula, because we do pretty well out of it.
Yeah, I mean, just a point on that point around need, because obviously, we've talked about the split as per population. So, what was it? Scotland's population is 9.7% or 10% of England's. Of England.
Yeah, and we're about 8.4% of the whole of the UK.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but because, we have 33% of the land mass, in terms of, say, transport spending, you will inevitably have to spend more per person in a country that's just less densely populated, that's got all these islands, etc., than you would otherwise. So I kind of, just to make that point so it doesn't seem like we're just kind of, each person is necessarily getting the corresponding benefit per head of population.
No, absolutely. And there's been some really nice studies done. There was one done by Hotham, I think around 2008, that sort of time, which did say that services cost more to deliver in Scotland. They do cost more to deliver because of all of these things you've mentioned, but they cost about 5% more to deliver.
Yeah.
So they do cost more to deliver, but not to the extent of based on all of the evidence and the analysis that has been done. I think it would be good for informing the public debate if that research was redone now, to be honest, to really understand that and to understand the extent to which things like transportation costs and all of these other challenges have changed, might well change that. But that's what the research says at the moment, that it is more to deliver it, but just not to the extent to which Barnett funds things.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Public Knowledge. I hope you found it valuable, and there's plenty more where that came from. So make sure you subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow us on social media, and do have a think about which 3 people you know who would find this episode valuable and send it to them. Help us build a critical mass of people bringing public knowledge to light, because some things should never be kept in the dark. Till next time.